Okay, they're ready.
All right. So
I'm going to start. It's time. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to the final meeting of CSRIC 5. Thanks, y'all, for coming today. It's cold out, and I think everybody else decided to take the meeting from their office. At least that's what I'm hoping. We had another meeting that was this small with this few people in attendance. That was a time that they shut the metro down the night before. Remember? And they told us like 5 p.m. the night before the meeting that they were shutting the whole metro down for the day of the CSRIC meeting, and it was the CSRIC meeting that was the reason for the shutdown. All right? You didn't know how important you all were. So anyway, welcome again. I'm Jeff Goldthorpe. I want to thank you all for all the time, all the talent, and all the effort you've put into the work here in CSRIC 5. We'll be hearing today from the final working groups that have presentations, not just presentations, but reports to deliver for a vote. So we'll be hearing from all I think there's 5 of them. And we'll be hearing from all 5 of those. We'll have votes. We won't be hearing any status reports today because all the other groups are finished. So with that, I will turn it over to Allison. Allison?
great. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. I'd like to welcome everybody today. And before I say my welcome, I'd just like to ask that you mute your cell phones. And if you're on the bridge, please mute your phone unless you'll be speaking. And we'll start shortly. So again, I'd like to echo Jeff's thanks for everyone attending today's final CSRIC 5 meeting, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize all the working groups for the time and the effort they've put in over the past 2 years. The partnership between industry, government, and academia, which CSRIC represents, is a valuable asset. The creative output from these diverse teams across federal, state, local governments, industry, and academia is useful in helping all of us to mitigate and manage risk. I can only offer my appreciation for the dedication and hard work and focus these groups have shown. So we really do appreciate the skills, the technical knowledge that everyone has shared as they've delivered today and have delivered in the past their final work products to the committee and the general public to help provide options for a more secure and reliable infrastructure. Today, we'll vote on 5 working group proposals. Working Group 5, Cybersecurity Information Sharing. Working Group 7, Cybersecurity Workforce. Working Group 8, Priority Services. Working Group 9, Wi-Fi Security. And Working Group 10, Legacy Systems and Security Risk Reductions. We'll have a Q&A at the end of each presentation and then use a simple voting forum of yay or nay for each working group. As with previous meetings, I'd like to suggest that we go around the room for introductions. If each council member would please introduce him or herself and the company and organization they represent. Suzanne will keep track of our attendees to ensure we have an appropriate quorum for our meeting. So let's start on my left and go clockwise around the room, then we'll go to the bridge.
I'm Dana Golub. I represent PBS.
Steve Barclay sitting in for Susan Miller from Addis.
Sure. Mark Paese, Department of Commerce, NOAA.
Lee Thibodeau from Insight.
Robert Mayer, U.S. Telecom.
Ethan Lucarelli on behalf of Donna Bethea Murphy in Marset.
William Check, NCTA.
Robert Morris here for Kyle Malady of Verizon.
Brian Joseph, CTIA.
Thank you. Now we'll go to the phone. So if each member could introduce themselves, please.
Andy Ellis with Akamai.
Richard Perlotta from Shadow Server.
Tim Walden, CenturyLink.
Mark Hattis, Comcast. Jeff Inglis, Silverstar.
Kim Keever, Fox Communications.
Penny Rogers, Sprint.
Mark Annis, City Riverside Office of Emergency Management.
Mary Boyd, West Safety.
Mary Haynes with Charter Communications representing Scott Weber.
Dorothy Spears-Dean with VITA.
Lori Flaherty, National 911 Program.
Francisco Brian Daly, Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management.
Commissioner Brian Dick. Commissioner Fenwick,
representing Neruk.
Jody
Brian
Joseph,
Daly,
sitting in for
AT&T.
Jennifer Manor, EchoStar.
Megan Brown from Wiley Ryan, here for Maureen McLaughlin of Iridium.
Cheryl Greathouse, APCO International.
Okay. Great, thank you. We have a quorum. So let's get started. We're going to start with Working Group 7, Cybersecurity Workforce. So, Drew, if you could come up and
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the members of the Working Group 7. For the past 18 months, this group has been meeting every other week, and in between working diligently to pull together a lot of information and provide a couple different products for consideration by the CSRIC. Obviously, in the beginning of it, with our interim report, we provided a guidance around the National Cybersecurity Workforce Framework, as well as a spreadsheet that included additions to it that we felt were needed to support the public safety and the telecom sector specifically. So that was the interim report. Today we're going to cover the final report. The emphasis will be on the recommendations from this working group. The first couple slides that I have are pretty much background. I put them in there really for completeness of the story. Since the set's posted, a lot of people may pull up just this spreadsheet or this presentation by itself. So I'm going to kind of go through these pretty quickly since you all have heard it before. So, working group objectives was basically to look at best practices, to evaluate this National Cybersecurity Workforce Framework for its applicability to the telecom industry, and to evaluate and make recommendations as to what we as an industry could do to help mitigate the challenges we have in terms of workforce development for cybersecurity expertise. I've kind of highlighted the deliverables already. This slide provides a little bit more specifics to it, but it really was an evaluation of the cybersecurity framework with a listing of KSAs, categories, et cetera, that are telecom specific, followed by final best practices recommendations for the CSRIC to recommend, I guess, as consideration for industry. Work Group 7 members, these folks work tirelessly and, of course, are all probably not here in person right now for the most part, mostly because of the snow, I guess, but hard to say. Maybe they're back at home watching the NCAAs, I'm not quite sure. By the way, my Wahoos are playing right now, so this is truly a sacrifice, me being here and presenting, but I will be able to see the score later. Final report and best practices. So what we did as a working group, and I will start spend a little bit of time on the slides as we go from here through the rest of them, is we broke up the problem into four pieces, if you will. We took a look at what was going on as far as requirements, needs, and best practices in 6 different areas, 3 that we termed internal segments. That would indicate industry, public safety, and academia, because they're internal and really partners directly with the components of the CSRIC and the member companies and the membership partners. The other 3 we looked at as being kind of external segments, federal government, state government, and then the financial sector as a reference model for what they've done. So our process was, yes, there's good old Waldo again, as always, and the current status is he's at the end of his journey. So, yes, we have gone through and completed the final report. That has been sent in and distributed to all of you all for review in advance of this presentation. But what we did, we proceeded through looking at each one of these different segments. As we evaluated each one of the segments, we identified by segment what we thought were excellent programs or examples of excellent programs being executed in the different segments. And then we leverage these to advise us as far as what could be best practices we could recommend. So when we looked at this challenge, the working group focused on what was going to be a rising tide that would float all boats. We didn't look at just one specific segment. We looked at all the segments, and we corroborated them together to look at what would help the entire industry to be better. So we looked at collaborative best practices across these different areas. We also looked at ways that we could support components like the academic community as far as increasing their ability to have a better throughput of skilled labor coming out of schools with better education or better skill sets or better practices already embedded. We also looked at some tactical approaches that would address immediate needs. Unfortunately, the reality is that we're looking at this as a longer-term solution, and so while we evaluated the tactical approaches, those are things that companies are doing today. We looked at them to advise us on what could be long-term solutions based on those tactical capabilities and tactical approaches. Some of the tactical approaches, of course, that we've talked about before in this council have been things like hiring from the Department of Defense, and that's kind of like squeezing a balloon, because if you recruit from the Department of Defense, they're skilled. Yes, we help the industry, but at the same token, we actually harm the overall community because we're taken from Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. So we tried to evaluate it more from a holistic approach as to what's going to help all the parties involved. So, on to the recommendations. First recommendation was that we say that the FCC should support a process for the communications industry to cooperatively support updates to the NICE cybersecurity workforce framework. Effectively, what we're saying is that we've created a data set in partnership with the Cybersecurity Workforce Alliance as well as other parties, and we provided modifications, enhancements to the Cybersecurity Workforce Framework from NICE. But we believe that there needs to be an ongoing active engagement in that space. That's nothing that can be mandated. It's something that we as an industry need to step up and say, yeah, we should do this, and we need to continue to have that encouragement amongst industry to pursue those types of capabilities. One of those areas that the FCC could participate actively in is identifying ways that you could engage with the Cybersecurity Workforce Alliance, which is really focused more from the standpoint of the financial sector, but there might be some partnership in some of the tools that they've developed and also in some of the ongoing modifications, enhancements to the Cybersecurity Workforce Framework that we might be able to do an ongoing partnership with. And I know that there's certain line challenges between what can be done between alliances like this, industry, and government, but it's worth further investigation by the FCC. Okay? So that was recommendation number one. Should I pause as I go or just keep going to the end? Keep going to the end. Yes. Okay, well, Allison's telling me what to do. I'm far be it from me to disagree. Okay, so recommendation number two, communications security or the communications industry can benefit by growing awareness of and supporting programs encouraging K through 12 use to cybersecurity. So what we're talking about here is how do we get that opening part of the funnel, get more kids engaged in STEM, get more kids excited about what can happen in the cybersecurity industry. And there were a couple of specific recommendations around this based on some of the programs we evaluated. Gen Cyber is a program that actually comes out of NSA. And their program to try and encourage youth to get involved in these types of studies and excitement around cybersecurity. Recommendations around that are that, BATEC or some other types of internship programs, summer programs for students. The other thing that we found rather interesting was the idea of cyber as a sport. And that is where industry could actually go in and help to co-sponsor within schools cyber challenges. The idea of actually having competitions within the school. There's nothing that gets youth engaged and excited about something than competing on it. I mean, we see all the involvement in sports. Why shouldn't we be doing the same thing in terms of cyber in our schools? So the guidance here was to basically identify to you all that we can benefit from this, and we would like the industry to look at ways that you can work with your local community and with some of these other programs that are documented in this report, and see if there are ways you can engage, your companies can engage with your local communities to help produce a bigger base for this funnel of talent that we're trying to see to grow and to educate as they grow older. So that was recommendation number two. Recommendation number three, FCC should encourage communications industry development of cooperative work-study partnerships. This one is really unique in that it is industry specific. The idea here is, when we talked about, I guess in the earlier, there's internships as kind of highlighted, but the idea of work study is that you actually are engaging directly with the university or academic community in partnership, where you actually have folks come in and are studying at the university, but they're also working full-time. The idea of these work-study program partnerships is that you can do certain things like apprenticeships, et cetera, but it becomes focused specifically on our requirements and our desires and our needs, more so our needs from workforce, and specific cybersecurity skills associated with telecommunications. So that's kind of what the focus is on this. It's slightly different. The idea of recommendation number 2 was to build a bigger base to draw from. The idea of number 3 is to actually have a continuing engagement as these folks go through the funnel and go from K through 12 into the college years and beyond, to try to figure out how you can engage them in work and study at the same time. We've also found, by the way, that last bullet is pretty interesting, is that the programs for workforce recruiting that are involved with internship and programs and apprenticeship have really served well as far as a tool to enhance your recruiting efforts. That came directly from the HR groups or HR representatives within the various companies that are participating in this workforce study. Okay, item number 4. Am I moving these along? I can't see. I can see these. I can't see the distant one. The FCC should engage with the communications industry to develop or expand scholarship for service programs in industry. The example here was scholarship for service program is, I guess it's the federal government Cyber Corps scholarship for service program that's, I want to say it's managed out of NSF, but it's handled by OPM and other agencies. And the idea here is that students are actually paid to go to a 2-year, 3-year, 4-year study program. They're actually paid, not only is their tuition all covered, but they're also paid to focus and get the cyber degree. When they finish that, they then have a certain time frame of service they need to pay back, if you will. So, for example, a 4-year study program may result in a 4-year commitment to work for the government. It's an excellent program. It actually was highlighted just recently in some of the comments on the Hill as far as when they're looking at cybersecurity, how to deal with workforce issues. So it is really a standout program, and it's something that we can emulate in industry normally through doing internships and things of that nature, but we don't really do this type of a program anymore, and it's probably something we should consider looking at as an option. It's your choice what you want to do, obviously, but it is a program that has actually highlighted that considering the people I just heard today, the percentage of students who are not being able to pay back their college debt is once again the highest it's been in quite some time. Their average debt is $30,000. I mean, if we can actually provide programs that enable these students to study in the cybersecurity spaces, and they're able to graduate college and be able to get a job because they've been encouraged the whole time through this process and not have a mountain of debt, you're talking about folks who can focus on the challenge at hand as opposed to distracted by the bills coming to their door. Okay, recommendation number 5. The FCC should encourage communications industry cybersecurity professionals to help train the next generation. Right now, the people who understand cybersecurity needs of the telecommunications industry are represented by the folks in this room. Okay, we have either our actual practitioners, or we actually manage those practitioners, or we actually have a group that manages those practitioners. Who best to help these students understand what cybersecurity means to the telecommunications and critical infrastructure community and the public safety community for that matter? We can actually find ways of participating. There's lots of different options you can do. Something as simple as encouraging some of your staff to go and do a little seminar at the local high school, encouraging them to say, hey, it's okay to do an adjunct professorship at a local university, all kinds of things like that. Just something that enables your folks who are cybersecurity savvy to get engaged and to actually encourage others to study the program and to bring their knowledge and their experience. And what's the first question they're going to get after every seminar is, what do I need to study to be able to be an effective cybersecurity warrior in the communications industry? I was talking to somebody today. That's the first question they asked me about. So this is the kind of area, once again, it's a policy of engagement, trying to engage folks either K through 12, engage them in college, and here in this case, engage them across the community. So it's, once again, policy of engagement is what our recommendation was there. Going to slide 6, right? I put my glasses on and off, but anyway. Okay, recommendation number 6. The FCC should encourage the communications industry to participate in the development of curriculum guidelines by the Joint Task Force on Cybersecurity Education. This is kind of a specific one, and the reason is there are a lot of different work groups out that are looking at curriculum guidelines. The Joint Task Force on Cybersecurity Education, they actually are out of ACM, which brought us the computer sciences curriculum guidelines. They're a cross-industry representative group. It includes a lot of academia as well as a lot of industry, East and West Coast. Why we recommend them specifically is because they are actually working already with DoD and other parties, and the whole objective is to have a curricular guideline that all the academic community can adapt to and adopt to. And anything that can help produce a faster time to market for this curricular guideline is going to benefit us all. Because the challenge is, until these universities can start putting out students who have a BS in cybersecurity, if you want to call it that, that has a consistent framework and a consistent baseline that we can all leverage, that we're still going to be hiring people with an unknown challenge, and we're going to have to do a lot of retraining. So the idea of the basic curricular guidelines is to set a common standard to which universities can look to, and which can then be implemented within the certification bodies that certify universities for the graduates that they produce. So that's one of the specific guidelines and recommendations we thought should be encouraged, is to try and get some more push behind this organization. Part of it is to help them get this final curricular guidelines across the finish line. And the other benefit is, if we get involved with it, we can kind of influence it to the requirements that we have and the needs we have within our industry. So, specific recommendation there. Recommendation number 7, the FCC, don't worry, there's only, I think, 9 recommendations, so we're almost done here. Recommendation number 7, the FCC should partner with communications industry, public safety, and the federal Gen Cyber to develop a cybersecurity distance learning program for public safety in rural communities. This is a kind of interesting one. One of the challenges that we see in the public safety space is that you have public safety personnel all around the country, in some cases in very small communities. They're not always very large or very well funded, or even have access to the type of infrastructure that we see in the cities and the universities and all of that. The Gen Cyber program is actually an outreach program from NSA, which is trying to set up different types of programs around the country to create little magnet areas, even if it's just a high school that would provide certain type of cybersecurity education. Cyber hygiene is a basic capability, and it would actually create little magnets around the area. Well, that in combination with the technologies that I know we have in some of our companies and that we're producing and evaluating and also demonstrating and leveraging around distance learning, to marry up that distance learning technology with these NSA-type programs that are community-based can not only help serve the local community, but can also help enable the public safety community to get some of the basic cyber hygiene training that they desperately need. And it has been called out in both of the reports of both the TFOPA reports on cybersecurity. So we thought it was a wonderful marriage opportunity. So we really think that it's one of those things where the FCC could maybe partner with these and try to bring these together and with public safety to see if this can really come to fruition. Plus, I think this also is is referenced the last presentation I guess we had, where there was a comment about Lynn Clark and the FCC and the NSA getting some of their funding, and their funding is to fund these types of programs. So the NSA should have funding for Gen Cyber, and there may be a partnership that could be had there, where they would actually help to fund setting up these areas where these things could be had. So anyway, food for thought. Okay. Recommendation number 8. Communications industry should support innovative cybersecurity workforce development initiatives such as the Cyber Blue program to engage populations with disabilities. This one I'm going to spend a few moments on because it's very unique and it really demonstrates the best of all possible outcomes. Uniquely, what Cyber Blue is that the George Washington University director of the I3P, which looks at infrastructure protection, actually was commenting to one of her cohorts at GW, who's a chair in the neurological studies. And they were discussing the challenges of cyber workforce and some of the unique needs of the cyber that you look for in a candidate for cyber workforce. And those unique needs are things that are, well, let's see, analytics, focus, a creativity type of element. As she was listing down the different types of characteristics, the gentleman looked at her and said, well, that sounds exactly like the community of autistic people. So now we're looking and saying what was born was an idea that says, look, there are millions, projected by 2020, about 3 million adults with autism in the U.S., and the programs we tend to have in the U.S. will take them all the way through age 18, but once they're over 18, the programs kind of fall off they fall off as far as capabilities. But these people have got tremendous analytical skills. They may not have the best social skills, and that's understood. But that's what the programs help to work with them, make them productive members of society. Now, as you look at this and say, well, that's pretty interesting. How does it really work? Well, actually, this innovative program has been adopted and has been implemented in Europe. In the UK specifically, their intelligence community as well as some of their other industries with resounding success. So here we're talking about a community that is millions of strong, that is an untapped resource that we can actually look at an innovative program such as CyberBlue and try to figure out how can we support a program like this to make this come to fruition, and are there other innovative programs that are out there that do something similar or that are looking at the problem differently. And that's what we wanted to say is that, look, it's important for us to look at how we can engage with these types of programs, how we can support them. And it's a combination of funding support, obviously. It's also a combination of figuring out how we can work with the universities to set up programs where they can do in partnership. Once again, extending the education capabilities through our telecom infrastructure. But it really is one of those key areas where I think we're going to be able to drive a substantial growth capability for our cyber workforce from a community that's underserved currently. So that's why I wanted to spend a few minutes on that one. I really do believe in it. It's a tremendous, tremendous program. Okay. Are we finally at 9? Okay. Communications industry cybersecurity experts should join the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education Working Groups, or one of its subgroups. We've got some great skills. Tremendous people in our organizations. We need to participate actively in NICE's work groups as they try to refine the cybersecurity workforce framework. That's going to serve us well in the long run, and that's just a recommendation to participate in that. Okay. So those are the recommendations. We had a list of some items for possible future activities, and I'll just briefly highlight what those are. Is that, the idea was to extend and integrate activities across the communications sector to raise cybersecurity awareness. We need to figure out how we continue to get that out there. We talked about a lot of things K through 12, supporting cyber exercises, et cetera, et cetera. The idea of supporting foundational research opportunities in areas including cyber awareness training, education, security usability, innovative programs such as CyberBlue. We need to continue to improve our understanding of sector-specific cybersecurity workforce needs. If we don't know what we're recruiting for, it's very difficult for us to really communicate what we need from academia. So we need to make sure we do that. And while we're doing that, we need to also make sure we make available guidelines, tools, and other resources, including communicating our needs, continuing to communicate our needs into the academic community. So with that, I'm finished with the presentation for now, and I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you, Drew, especially for the depth and breadth of all those recommendations.
Yeah,
So,
sorry, it was a lot.
That's great. Very creative. Why don't we start in the room with Q&A, then we'll move to the bridge. So any questions in the room? Okay, we'll go to the bridge. Okay, if not, no questions, then let's have a yay or nay vote. In the room first, we'll start. Okay. And onto the bridge.
Yay.
Yay, yay, yay.
Yay.
Waldo, yay.
Yay, Waldo.
Yay.
Right. Sounds that we've accepted those recommendations.
Excellent.
So thank you very much for
Thank you
your work
once again.
to your team.
We had a great team, and we enjoyed doing this work for you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go next to Chris Boyer and Rod Rasmussen for cybersecurity information sharing.
Do you guys have the slides?
Yeah, you
Just click it and I'll...
if you press, there you go.
There we go. All right. So my name's Chris Boyer from AT&T and one of the co-chairs of Working Group 5. Rod Rasmussen is my fellow co-chair, and I wanted to thank Rod and the entire team for all of the work. This is the final report of Working Group 5 on cybersecurity information sharing. What I'll do today is walk through the different deliverables that the working group provided throughout the process, and then talk about the recommendations that we're making today. So to start with, the working group timeline, this just basically breaks down the various work products that the working group produced. If you go back to 2015, the original tasking for Working Group 5 was to develop recommendations to the Council to encourage the sharing of cybersecurity information between companies in the communications sector. We had 6 different deliverables that we produced throughout this process. The first one was a notional diagram that illustrated information sharing within the industry. And that diagram was then used as a basis to formulate several use cases, which we presented in May of 2016. And then throughout last summer and fall, we talked about impediments and barriers to information sharing and information sharing trust pools and platforms. By trust pools, we're talking about different entities that information could be shared with and how those broke down. And then platforms was kind of the means by which information was shared. And then we concluded today with presenting the information sharing recommendations in the final report. The members, this is just a breakdown of the members, but as you can see, we had a very large working group from across the industry and various trade associations and with members from the Commission and elsewhere, so we had a very active team. And the next slide talks a little bit about, this is the diagram that I mentioned before, the first deliverable that we provided. This is the information sharing diagram that we've talked numerous times before the Council. If you look at the diagram again, focusing from left to right, what it's intended to illustrate is the various groups at a macro level that communications industry partners are sharing information with today. From the left-hand side, talking mostly about private-to-private arrangements, whether those are industry peer groups or the network service providers group or the other industry sources that provide information, and then working over to the right where we talk more about sharing between the private sector and government. So the breakdown largely goes into private-to-private and private-to-government-to-private sharing. I won't go through the entire diagram, but as we've talked about it before, but it gives you an idea of at a macro level, who we're sharing with and the types of information if you look at the scale on the far right. So in terms of information sharing, again, this is a recap of what we came up with. This is the private-to-private piece. If you look at this, when we looked at private-to-private sharing, we looked at it from 4 different spectrums. One was the formality of the relationship, meaning that when you share in the private industry, you can have either formal or informal relationships. So formal would be things like contractual or groups where you have to be vetted and voted on to be a member, to informal relationships, which are really kind of personal relationships, open source, listservs, and those types of information sharing venues. And on the other side of the spectrum was the structure of the data. Data can be either structured, meaning it's got data feeds, it's machine readable, it can be shared in real time, it's more computerized data that can be acted upon, versus unstructured data, which is things like mailing lists, phone calls, conferences, actual conversations that are going on to a large degree. So if you look at those 2 different spectrums, that's kind of how we viewed private-to-private sharing. And then the next slide shows kind of how we broke those down. So we came up with 4 different quadrants between formal and structured, formal unstructured, informal structured, and informal unstructured. And so in each one of those quadrants, there are different examples of how the industry is sharing information today. So an example of that would be under the formal unstructured, you have things like the NSP group, the Network Service Providers group, that meets regularly to talk about threats to the industry. That can then be shared amongst the large service providers that are a member of that. There's other groups like like the APWG or the MOG or just a litany of organizations that are involved in cybersecurity, where informally, in an unstructured basis, there's lots of conversations about things that are going on. And then on the right-hand side, we talk about formal and informal structured groups. So these are things like, formal structured could be things like the Sticks and Taxi AIS server that DHS runs, or in the private sector industry, we've been doing a pilot that was originally started by CTIA to share information within the industry, leveraging Sticks and Taxi. Those would be examples of a more formal structured setup. But again, examples of how we do private-to-private sharing today. The next slide talks about private to government sharing. What we did there is largely we did a series of use cases. So we looked at specific topics that were raised by the working group. So we looked at an EAS service disruption. We looked at a data breach investigative report. We looked at sharing between a foreign government to U.S. industry. We did a TDOS use case. We looked at the Heartbleed attack. We looked at the National Cyber Forensics Training Organization government use case. We did one on solar flares. We also looked at hacktivist threats, social engineering, and an example botnet. And we even, at one point, we included some information about, oh God, I'm drawing a blank here, on ransomware at the Admiral's request at the time. So those are examples of the different use cases that we focused on the government, private to government sharing realm. Any questions so far? Okay. So moving right along. Then we talked about the different barriers. So the notional diagram set up the basis. We did the use cases and now we're talking about barriers. So from a barriers perspective, the working group identified 6 different barriers in different categories. So I'm not going to go through the specific barriers, but I'll just list the categories. They were organizational challenges, operational barriers, technical barriers, consumer and market considerations, financial barriers, and then legal and policy considerations. So depending upon each one of these issues, organizational issues could be things like, certain businesses are more equipped to receive information and act on it than others. There's clearly a breakdown between the larger carriers and small and medium-sized businesses for obvious reasons. That also ties into the operational and technical barriers. We've also identified through some of the pilot work that was done with CTIA and others that there are issues with the Sticks and Taxi protocol that don't make it a perfect medium for communications threats, in particular threats on things like TDOS and other specific communications-related matters. We also looked into consumer and market considerations of financial barriers. And then the last one was legal and policy considerations. We had the Department of Justice come in and do a briefing on the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act that was passed back in 2015 and how that fits into our work and what those issues would be there. So that was another factor that was considered by the working group. Finally, we get to the trust pools. So with trust pools, we've basically broken down into different categories, but effectively we define trust as including confidentially, meaning information that is shared within a specific environment or regime, and responsibly without leaking or retribution, and that can only appropriate or authorized people have access to the information. So that was kind of how we defined a trust group. So it was basically information that we would share in a trusted environment that would not, we had confidence that the entity we were sharing with would not leak that information or provide it to someone who was unauthorized. Basically, they consist of basic participants who are basically stakeholders with common interest in goals and capabilities. So there's a lot of different trust groups in cybersecurity. A good example of that might be the ISAOs that are being started right now. That's a type of a trust group. As I said, the network service providers group is another type of trust group. There's groups like Ops Trust, which is like a third-party operationally focused group that you have to be vetted for. So there's different types of trust groups that are there. And then within each trust group, the participants have to be credible and build on, and usually they're building on an initial informal relationship based upon a common scope of interest. You're talking about individuals who are interested in cybersecurity that have a relationship with someone in the industry that have been kind of vouched for. That seems to be how a lot of these trust groups and trust pools are being established these days. So it's on a bit of an ad hoc basis, but it's through relationships that have been previously established. And then usually the trust pools have a rally point or a focus area. So one example could be MOG, the Messaging Anti-Abuse Working Group, which is focusing on anti-abuse activities. So they would have a common issue that they're focused on, and that would be the rallying point to bring these different entities together. And then in terms of the breakdown of different types of trust groups, these are just examples. So what we did is we looked at kind of industry-driven versus sector-driven. So industry-driven, you have things like the U.S. Telecom Cyber Working Group, CTIA and NCTA both have corollaries to that. I mentioned MOG, things like the ISAOs, vetted security communities, et cetera. And then on the other side of the slide, you have a breakdown of a lot of the government-driven initiatives, that are driven by the sector and potentially in partnership with government. And then the last item that we worked on, this was what we produced in the last meeting, was a breakdown of the different types of conduits or means of sharing information. And really this ranges from the most informal means, which is things like phone calls, emails, teleconferences, to the most formal, which is things like automated sharing through things like a portal, leveraging things like Sticks and Taxi and items such as full-scale exercises and tabletops. So it goes from a spectrum from informal to formal relationships of information. And so that's kind of the last report that we did. So that's the background piece on what the working group accomplished over the last, I'd say, 18 plus months. In terms of the final recommendations, there's 6 recommendations that we had, and I'll quickly run through those. The first one is that the FCC should acknowledge the breadth and depth of information sharing that's currently underway in place within the industry and between the industry and government. There's a lot of different things already happening and that we can build on, and the FCC has the ability to be involved in a lot of those activities along with the industry, and so I think on both ends we should acknowledge that and build upon a lot of the existing mechanisms. The second one is that the industry should continue its efforts to conduct and expand upon the current pilot that it has underway regarding information sharing using Sticks and Taxi. As I mentioned before, this started with CTIA. It's now expanded, and there's multiple members of that today. And the goal there was to determine if those protocols and the needs of the communications industry, can be met by those protocols. And then also, what are the challenges related to the sector integrating with the AIS portal, the Automated Indicator Sharing Portal that DHS is establishing following the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Bill from last year. And then the third recommendation is that the industry should enhance its ISAC by developing a hosted private website on which government entities, industry partners, and stakeholders can register to access cybersecurity resources. Effectively, what this means is that today we do a lot of sharing within the industry through conference calls and meetings, and also through the NCC, the National Communications Center within the NCIC. And we get a lot of feeds out of those groups, but there is no kind of repository today where we can share information with our industry peers on a more mechanized basis. So the idea here would be to create a portal where we could parse information and distribute it to different parties in the industry. And so you could have a feed that goes to, people could register for it, and you could have a feed that basically said if you're like a mobility, in the mobility business, you would get only information related to mobility. If you were a small business, we could parse the data and provide only information that was useful to a small and medium-sized business as opposed to a large enterprise. So create a portal that would build on top of what the ISAC's doing and parse the information and deliver it to different audiences that might find it most relevant to what their needs are. And that's something that the ISAC, we have within the Sector Coordinating Council, we have an ongoing initiative, an information sharing committee that I was the chair of last year that Joe Vines, who's also the chair of the Comms ISAC, is leading this year. And that's one of the things that we're talking about actively building going forward. The final 3 recommendations are that the public and private sector should continue to work together to develop, promote, and enhance cybersecurity education and awareness within the sector, including educating small and medium-sized businesses regarding the depth and breadth of existing venues that offer cyber threat information sharing opportunities. So one of the things we came to the conclusion of is that a big challenge in cyber information sharing is that if you're not kind of in the know, if you're not on the list, it's sometimes hard to know what's actually going on because a lot of it is, as I mentioned before, is starts with informal, trusted relationships. So there's a need for the sector to kind of work more closely with a broader base of members than just kind of some of the usual suspects to promote and make folks aware of the opportunities they have to share information. And then the last 2, another one is that the government should promote a grant program to provide funding to small and medium-sized businesses so that they may obtain or develop resources necessary to robustly participate in information sharing. So this kind of goes to the issue of, and again, I can't speak for small and medium-sized carriers, obviously representing AT&T, but this goes basically to the issue of there's a lack of resources. So it ties into what Drew just presented from the workforce group. A lot of small and medium-sized businesses either don't have the resources or they don't have the people to ingest this information and act on it. So there's a need to explore different ways to help them build those capabilities more aggressively. And then the last one is that there's been a lot of threat intelligence gathering and client-tailored information sharing that's provided on a proprietary basis. So this kind of goes to commercial services. A lot of companies, including mine and others that are in this room, we provide threat intelligence services. There's a lot of third parties that provide threat intelligence services. So there's a lot of information that's shared outside of kind of the in-kick and government-led processes. So we should think about policies that really encourage and support those types of efforts continuing, because they are what ultimately funds a lot of the research and capabilities that are built in the cybersecurity realm. So those are the final recommendations from the working group. With that, I'll take any questions.
Chris, thank you, and thanks, Rod, and your team for sharing this elegant framework and these recommendations. So does anyone in the room have any questions? Okay. If not, anyone on the bridge? Okay, hearing no questions in the room, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed, please say nay. And on the bridge, all those in favor of adopting these, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, and anyone opposed, nay. All right, well, it looks like we've accepted this, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everybody on the team for the last year and a half worth of work.
Okay. Next, we have Bill Reedway with Working Group 8 and Priority Services.
Thank you, everybody. Bill Reedway from New Star, one of the co-chairs from Working Group 8. Like the other folks, I will take this opportunity to thank everybody that participated on the working group, from our liaisons from the Commission, from ADIS and the standards bodies, the service providers, vendors, and in particular the folks from Homeland Security Office of Emergency Communications. We have submitted our final report to the CSRIC on March 1st. As I mentioned in December, the vast majority of the report was complete prior to my December update. We made a few refinements, particularly to the IoT section and a couple of bits on authentication and security. But the lion's share of this you all have seen before. So in the interest of keeping everybody warm and safe and moving, I'll move through this pretty quickly and look forward to taking your questions. So just as a reminder, the charter for Working Group 8 was to assess frameworks and options for next generation priority services given the ongoing transition to packet-based networks. This was positioned both as presenting a number of challenges, but also a number of opportunities. Here's what the working group looks like. I should also mention a note of thanks to my co-chair on this, Tom Anderson, who put a ton of work into this prior to his retirement in September. But honestly, all thanks goes to the people on the screen right now. A bit of just in terms of how we arrived at this point, the group did meet every other week with several face-to-face meetings. We engaged heavily with the Department of Homeland Security in a bidirectional environment, with us presenting feedback to their user community and obviously their participation in the working group. And today represents our final presentation. So you all have seen this before. Our first deliverable for the CSRIC in terms of the foundation for our report was identifying a framework to think about the problem. A number of the initial questions that came out in the working group's original charter were related to network, related to quality of service, authentication, security, and so on. We took a kind of broad interpretation of that and identified 3 layers at which a next generation priority services program needed to be looked at. The first, the foundational layer, were obviously the network pieces, where more and more we're finding ourselves in a hybridized environment, public versus private networks, domestic versus international, IP and TDM, all of which need to interoperate together to make priority services function. On top of that, we identified a user layer. where we had to think about increased volumes of both human beings and machines that would be requiring priority services in the future, and what the order management and provisioning and billing infrastructure might be like. And then finally, an application layer on top of that, where we obviously spend some time thinking about voice, text, and video, but in particular, IoT being the big driver of change in terms of what was going to be required in the future. If this were at all legible from the screen, you could see what I meant, but this is the outline of the report, and this is the structure that it follows. So what I'll do here is I'll just very quickly go through the recommendations which we described for you all in December, and which will go into further detail in the report. First of all, the recommendations are generally speaking to prepare for significantly increased volume and scale for priority services. Looking back historically over the last 6 years, the increase of users has been heading along at a clip of between 3 and 5% a year, and this is true for both GETS and WPS. The expectation is that barring a major event or a major shift in policy, from a human being's point of view, that should remain pretty constant. However, once you bring IoT into the mix, then you begin to look at some potentially exponential changes in the volume and scale. So, given that, order management, provisioning, needs to be a focus in terms of keeping things simple to access, simple to register, and automating as much as possible. The second impact of a significantly increased user base has to do with assessing the potential impacts of scenarios where priority may need to be reduced on a dynamic basis. Specific to a major event, you can imagine hierarchies of priority from the President of the United States all the way down to local police and emergency services. In a period of heavy congestion, one of our recommendations is that the Commission assess options for allowing for certain levels of preemption in those circumstances. We're requesting a reaffirmation of guidance with respect to user clarifications and user classifications, and also because of the increasing need to cover not just human-to-human communications, but also human-to-machine and machine-to-machine, an assessment of the role of what those mission-critical application providers, social media and content providers would be. I'll talk about IoT a little bit later in the presentation. Once again, assessing relative classification of 911 and priority communications in light of transition to full IP networks. Classifications for preemption of communications for non-priority and lower priority in an over-constrained environment. Seeking commonality in priority assignment and quality of service for communications that cross national borders. And in particular to the FirstNet program, which is still in the process of rolling out, there are specific scenarios contemplated in that project where FirstNet traffic may end up being carried by commercial networks. So there are certain provisions with respect to local control and preemption that are going to require some attention from the Commission. So just a little bit more on IoT and application classification, and the report goes into some detail with respect to different classes of IoT that could conceivably find themselves in need of priority. This will vary based on what types of machines we're talking about getting access to the network, in terms of what levels of latency are required, what levels of data preservation are required. Everything from environmental sensors to wearables, surveillance cameras, and so on and so forth, all may be absolutely essential to maintain priority during an event, and the recommendations are that an application framework be put in place that covers those scenarios. And then finally, with respect to authentication and security with respect to priority, we're recommending an extension of some of the protocols under consideration for robocall mitigation and anti-spoofing. The idea being that if you can ensure a level of authentication to the network for the purpose of mitigating caller ID spoofing and robo-dialing, that same protocol can in fact be extended to cover authentication and access to priority services. So with all the discussion going on right now with the STIR and Shaken protocols, the recommendation is that those be looked at to be extended to support authentication to priority services as well. Okay, and then our next steps is for me to complete this presentation. Check. And then to incorporate any feedback from the CSRIC. And I think thus endeth Working Group 8's final presentation, and happy to take any questions that the group has.
Okay, Bill, thank you and your team for all your work on this important topic. So we'll go to the room first. Anyone have any questions? Okay, if not, we'll go to the bridge. Any questions? All right, so we will vote, and in the room, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, and on the anyone opposed, please say nay. And on the bridge, all those in favor of adoption, please say aye.
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 Okay.
Aye.
And anyone opposed, please say nay. Great, looks like we've adopted your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very, very much.
Okay, next up, we are going to have Working Group 9's presentation from Brian Daly, who unfortunately the weather did not cooperate and his flight was canceled. So Brian's on the bridge. I will advance his slides. So Brian, if you'd like to start.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and advance to slide 2. So topics for today, I'll give it just a brief background of Working Group 9, our objectives and deliverable and membership, brief status update, which is the completion of the report, and then finally the approval of the report. If we could move to slide 3. We set out with the objective of looking at Wi-Fi security and security concerns that utilize Wi-Fi devices and spectrum. There are numerous methods that are being used today to secure networks and connected devices from malicious attacks. So what we set out to do was to take a survey of what those existing methods were, try to identify any gaps or any deficiencies in those existing methods, and make some further recommendations. Specifically, we were looking to identify the threats most consistently facing Wi-Fi network operators and users, the available techniques to prevent and or remediate those threats, and look at how each technique is effective against those threats. And again, we were chartered to prepare and present the recommended security best practices at this meeting. Next slide, please. Well, first off, I'd like to give a big thank you to all the participants that are listed on this slide. I won't go through them individually, but we did have roughly biweekly meetings and email discussions, and certainly want to thank those individuals and the companies that supported them in this effort. And also our FCC liaisons, both Peter and Kirian, for their efforts, and our editor of the document, which was Dwayne Sennett from AT&T as well. Again, thank you to all those that participated. Next slide. So when we look at our deliverable, there were a number of different topics that we focused on. The first was really Section 4, which is listed here, which was what we just called the background material. We took an in-depth look at the Wi-Fi threats and looked at the potential use cases and how those threats really apply to the various use cases. And when we looked at various use cases, it really came down to a couple of different ones that stood out that really encompassed the use cases more broadly. and that was the hotel Wi-Fi network use case and the convention center or public venue Wi-Fi network use cases. So we went through, defined those use cases and looked at potential security threats for each of the various use cases. We looked at things like spectrum management, how rogue access points may be misconfigured or malfunctioning, and how to mitigate some of these different types of security threats. As a result of that analysis, we then came through and defined some best practices, the common sense rules for public venues, common sense or best practices to deal with rogue access points. We also looked at previous work from CSRIC Working Group 2A, which had a number of recommendations that they made, and we analyzed and reinforced those recommendations in here. And then there were a number of best practices that were presented to us from Cisco. And then finally, we have a couple of recommendations that we did want to bring forward that felt that there could be further action that could be taken on in order to help with the overall Wi-Fi security. So if we move to the next slide, just in summary, Wi-Fi security is an important function. It's been the topic of investigation of several working groups in the industry and in the federal government. The best practice recommendations that we have looked at are supplementary and complementary to the work of these other groups. We intentionally didn't want to duplicate the efforts of other groups, and especially we didn't want to create a set of best practices which conflicted with the recommendations of other groups. Thus, we incorporated, at least by reference, the best practices from documents of these other groups, including, as I mentioned, the common sense rules for public venues and the best practices to deal with the rogue access points. Next slide, please. We did come up with 3 recommendations. First off, we recommend that the FCC resolve that policy and legal issues regarding the ability of enterprise customers or network operators to use deauthentication to protect Wi-Fi networks from legitimate cybersecurity threats. Specific actions that a Wi-Fi operator can take to protect consumers are unclear. For example, the working group felt it should be permissible for a network operator to use deauthentication, which is included in the IEEE 802.11 standard, to ensure network security. And they would use this to shut down an access point that is either spoofing or doing some other type of cyber attack. And while the FCC Part 15 rules don't preclude such use, and FCC Chairman, former FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler did acknowledge in a letter to Congress that deauthentication has a legitimate use, we feel there is still some areas for regulatory clarity in this particular space. The second recommendation is that business or wireless network providers implement an authenticatable network based on either X.509 network identities or SIM cards, and provide a more robust registration method for short-term clients. After mutual authentication, we assume the network connection will also be encrypted, and these recommendations are to ensure that the clients have a secure experience and mitigate threats such as the evil twin and man-in-the-middle attacks that can compromise data on the wireless networks. The third recommendation is recommending a method or technology be developed that allows a client, during the registration to use a wireless network, be able to securely obtain and pin specific network authentication keys in their client device. And this would be to better protect the client from third-party trust store problems. And again, you know, this is looking again at future technologies and where the wireless supplicant can alert on illegitimate network credentials and not allow connection, thus protecting their clients. So with that, if we go to the final slide, again, I want to give a thank you to all those that supported this project, and I'll conclude the presentation and open it up for any questions.
Brian, thank you very much, and thanks to your team. I know you've done a lot of good work in a relatively short period of time. So why don't we first go in the room? Any questions? Okay. If not, on the bridge, are there any questions? All right, then we'll start in the room with voting. If everyone in favor could please indicate that by saying aye. Aye. Anyone opposed, please say nay. Great. And on the bridge, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay.
Aye.
Great. Thank you. Any nays? If not, we accept that, and we'll move on to our final working group presentation. I think, John, you're here. John Kimmons is here to present Working Group's 10 work on legacy systems and securities risk reduction.
Thank you. I guess first I'd like to thank all the working group members because we had a very aggressive schedule. We were one of the last groups to be created in the June of last year timeframe. We really started in earnest in July and virtually had weekly conference calls to be able to produce the deliverables that I'll talk about. So, okay. The first part of my talk is just kind of recapping our charter and the risk assessment that we did that we produced in the December timeframe. So I just want to recap that, and that's what we built on to produce our final report that is the back end of the talk. So again, the scope of this working group is the telecommunications core infrastructure, the signaling network, legacy in terms of SS7 protocol, and the transition to the diameter signaling protocol. And we were looking at the threats and vulnerabilities to that network in terms of what's been reported, what's been demonstrated, what's been seen in all different types of forums, as well as carrier experiences, subject matter experts, and things like that. So again, we were more focused in on the core network versus the access. You know, you've heard talks about, let's say, Wi-Fi access or cell towers or whatever. We really weren't focused, even though we recognize that that's an area where people exploit to then be able to attack the core. So again, we created two deliverables. One was the risk assessment report. But just in terms of background, my co-chair is Danny McPherson from VeriSign, and we had approximately 20 people on the working group, a mix of people from the government like DHS, FCC, NIST, and then a cross-section in terms of carriers, suppliers in the industry. I also recognize that we had briefings from subject matter experts and people who are actually working in the field in terms of standards bodies, working with different technology to detect some of these attacks, to counter, block some of these attacks, and things like that. So there was a very cross-section of people and expertise in the group. So we produced a risk assessment, and we produced two versions, and I talked about that the last time, but just to remind people, there's two versions. One is, we call it the full report that talks about attack scenarios, how people attack networks, the actual exploits and methods and procedures and things like that. We believe that that's sensitive, so it's a restricted version. And there's a procedure in terms of getting access to that. And then there's a public version where a lot of those, the details are redacted. And then the summary report that I'm talking about today is kind of a collection of some of the background in terms of the technology, some of the assessment analysis that we did, and then the final recommendations. So when we did the risk assessment, we were looking at mobile and fixed line, and also, as I said, the architectures that are there, the different network elements, the protocols like SS7, and as I said, diameter has a different type of architecture. And then the interfaces, the interconnection between service providers that make the network work in terms of roaming, supporting roaming customers and things like that. And also looking at the different types of entities. You have carriers and then players like aggregators who are providing wholesale access to a global infrastructure of signaling. We also, as I said, looked at the threat landscape and the risk assessment in terms of different types of exploits. But we also looked at the business environment, the operations environment that's making some of these attacks possible in the sense of how does somebody who wants to intrude, how do they gain access? Because initially this, as you know, was a closed network and now it's more open. So just to recap some of the findings from the risk assessment that we built upon. The overwhelming amount of SS7 traffic is legitimate traffic. We're not seeing mass attacks, but we're also notice that there is a lot of, as we call it, information sharing in terms of the attack methodologies that are being discussed in all different types of settings, conferences, industry forums, the dark web, whatever. And what they're building upon is the interconnected trust ecosystem that's been around for many, many years. So how do you get access? They're also building upon the different types of services that are built upon that. So now you have more coverage, more participants, and more interconnection. There's gaps in terms of the trust model. And also, both here in the United States as well as overseas, there's business types of models where they're renting out space in their data center where you can just plug into the access network, telecom network, and be looked at as a legitimate service provider, whether you are or you aren't. Okay, so we also have to recognize the business models out there and the operations kind of thing that are playing into this in terms of increasing the frequency of the attacks, volume of attacks, and things like that. So different motivations, obviously, when people are attacking things. And we talked about that, last time in terms of location tracking an individual or a group of people, intercepting calls, fraud, denial of service. So there's a whole set of, different types of attacks with different motives. And there's a lot of technology products to counter these types of attacks that are out there. We've taken the firewall concept that everybody knows from the internet world, in terms of SS7 type firewalls. Also, aspects of data analytics, hardening our network elements so somebody can't get just in on the management channel and do their thing. Okay, so there's been a lot of work done by the industry to avoid any impacts in terms of an intrusion or detect it, block it, whatever. We also recognize that there's been a lot of industry groups, standards bodies. One that we've highlight and will highlight in our recommendations is GSMA, where a lot of expertise is there, and they produce best practices and guidance in the industry to the industry, especially in the telecom space that we're talking about. So we also recognize the standards bodies, 3GPP and others that are also providing guidance in this area. So that's really kind of in a nutshell. This is where the risk assessment brought us, and then we continue to do the analysis to then come up with our recommendations. And basically the recommendations are structured. The first one is focused in terms of the FCC, and the rest of the recommendations are focused on the industry. So the first one is we couldn't cover everything and look at everything in total detail. Plus, we also recognize that there's transitions going on. Okay, so when we talk about diameter has been around for a little while, but it's still being deployed. It's still migrating, finding its way in terms of becoming a mainstream signaling protocol in the interconnection area. Okay, obviously we're also evolving towards 5G networks. And what we recognize is that it takes time to understand all the potential threats and vulnerabilities to a new technology. We believe that some of the techniques that are being used today, attack vectors, will be applied to this new technology and new services. Some will be successful. Some will have to accommodate the uniqueness of a given new protocol or whatever. But we believe that more work has to be done in this area. So our recommendation is that the next CSRIC continue looking at this, making recommendations, and moving the ball forward in terms of diameter and 5G. I'm going to talk about the next thing in another recommendation, but there is something called the Circle of Trust that is an idea, an intriguing idea that's in 3GPP, a standards body, that I think will potentially help us architect more effectively some of the controls that we put in place. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But we believe also those ideas, those concepts should be continued and analyzed and see if they're really feasible to really implement. Our main focus also has been on GSM technology. Obviously, we recognize there's other non-GSM technology out there in terms of signaling systems and things like that. Also, voice over IP using the SIP protocol, advanced intelligent network, etc. Okay, so there are other architectures and technologies out there. We weren't able to cover all of it. As I said, we really put our arms around GSM and that space. So the next set of recommendations, as I said, is more focused in terms of industry. But our number one recommendation in terms of the carriers, subject matter experts, and things like that is you got to monitor your interconnection points. No surprise, it's like monitoring your internet connection. Okay, you got to monitor it, you got to filter it, you got to firewall it. That's the most effective countermeasure. Okay, and in the diagram that's in the chart, you most likely can't make it all out, but it is from a subject matter expert. Carlston Noel's been in this area for quite a while, and the interesting thing here is it starts getting down to the types of messages. There are many messages in a given protocol, but this one is focused. You should be focusing in this example on 10 messages, message types in the SS7 suite. And you have different types of defense mechanisms where you may be doing analytics, you may be blocking that type of message, and things like that. And then there's the architectural context. Where do you do it? Well, you have to do it at your interconnection point, but that means, it could be in a given network element, it could be a standalone, it could be a module on a given network element. I mean, we didn't get into the architectural options that you could implement something, but we know that it has to be implemented. Also, some of the other nodes where your customer information, customer profile information is stored, that's obviously a target. Okay, if they want to target an individual like yourself, okay, they want to get more information about you, they're going to target an HLR and things like that. So this is really getting into how do you monitor, how do you put it all together in terms of monitoring the traffic, firewalling, and then supporting it with data analytics, because you have to recognize that attacks adapt. If they're unsuccessful sending a particular signaling system message and it's blocked, they're going to adapt and say, well, maybe I'll try another type of message. Okay, so there is a constant evolution here of data analytics that have to be backing this up. GSMA has a security best practices documents and guidelines for SS7 and diameter. Okay, one little thing that maybe I should talk about. Half the working group members were not members of GSMA, because that's a membership driven organization. So we were able to negotiate a liaison with GSMA. So the people who were non-GSMA members got access to these documents, so they weren't blindly making recommendations without ever seeing the documents and what the documents said. Okay, so we were able to negotiate that, which GSMA was great about it. So I was able to pass out the 4 relevant documents to all those non-GSMA government folks at DHS or whatever. Okay, so everybody understood. And these are documents that are written by experts in the industry, and a lot of the recommendations follow or endorse these types of best practices. Yeah, I don't know if any of the other working groups ran into that problem, but we ran into that issue with the GSMA and being able to use their documents. Okay, another aspect in terms of is signaling aggregators. As I mentioned, besides just having carriers, interconnecting among themselves as peers, there are signaling aggregators. There's many around the world. There's 3 or 4 big ones. Okay, where they're doing wholesale terminations where you may plug in and then be able to reach out to a broader world in terms of domestic and international endpoints, but signaling traffic that's terminating here in the United States. So they have a very key role. They see a lot of traffic that an individual carrier may not see. Okay, so we're saying we need to embrace them. Usually a major carrier may have an association with 2 or 3 aggregators, but there's more too in terms of the infrastructure here in the United States and globally. And a lot of these, a number of the attacks originate from overseas. Okay, so who's seeing the bigger picture? It's just like the internet in terms of some of the core routers and core ISPs see a lot broader view of the traffic than individual enterprises, for example, may see, or a local ISP. So we're saying we have to embrace them in these efforts, and this ability to monitor and filter and do some analytics and maybe detect some malicious attacks, would be more effective than just everybody kind of doing their own thing. The next one builds upon the talk from Working Group 5 on information sharing. Okay, so we're not trying to duplicate that work, but we also our focus really is to make sure that and it was briefly mentioned in the talk, was that yes, focus in on IT issues and risks and vulnerabilities, et cetera, and the IP network and that type of technology. Our world is telecom, SS7s, signaling messages, and things like that. So we're very heavily focused in on telecom use cases. Okay, and CTIA had a sponsored pilot that focused in on that. So we could, GSMA has now a capability where they track trouble reports or incident reports that are focused in on this interconnection and signaling infrastructure types of risks. So we just say, okay, we need to make sure that this threat information sharing is addressing all different sectors, the communication sector, building upon the what's there today in terms of DHS and the NKIC and all the groups that you saw on the slide earlier. Okay, but we need to make sure that the telecom use cases are also covered in terms of the information sharing, so that we get maximum benefit and we can adapt the controls that we have out there as threats and attack vectors change. So I'm not going to repeat all of what I said about diameter and 5G. I think the point on this one is that we also recognize that critical infrastructure sectors are going to be relying on the evolution of the network in terms of diameter and 5G. Okay, whether it's whatever the sector, whether it's the comm sector, or energy, or whatever. Okay, it cuts across the whole infrastructure. So critical infrastructure is also part of this. And the recommendation is for industry to continue to participate in the standards forums and also adopt In this particular case, GSMA recommended diameter controls, but we also recognize that we don't know everything about diameter security today. Okay, we have some concepts, some things that we applied, but as time goes on, we're going to learn more from the attackers and how they're targeting different elements, the edges of the protocol itself, the architecture, whatever. We also recognize that 5G has things like network functional virtualization, NFV. Okay, that is evolving. Different industry standards bodies are looking at that. Security of NFV is still kind of a slow roll in some of these activities, or they're looking at very small niches, part of it. So we believe that if this is a mainstream change in terms of the infrastructure, that we really need to get our hands around the virtualization security as the network evolves. So that's another element when we start talking about 5G types of networks. The circle of trust. What we're saying is now that we have all these peer relationships. Now, traditionally, you were able to trust your peer, okay, because a well-recognized entity, carrier, whatever. Okay, but now there's such a variety of entities, it's very hard to gauge. So there's this concept of how do I determine the trust level of my peer, which then gets involved in terms of what questions do you ask, what information you get, how do you verify the information you receive, and then once you determine different assurance, trust levels, how does that equate to the different types of controls that you may be deploying at your interconnection point with this peer. You may say, I really trust this peer, so I'm going to do less monitoring and filtering. I don't need to put all my energy there. But these other interconnection partners, I'm not sure. Okay, so maybe something like that will evolve over time. But when you get into trust is one of these words that's very loaded, means a lot of different things. How do you measure it? And all that kind of stuff. But it's kind of an intriguing concept that's being talked about in 3GPP. Various suppliers and participants are contributing to that effort. So we're saying that we just need to kind of monitor that work, see if it's applicable, feasible, workable, etc. And maybe it will help in terms of balancing the investment that needs to be done across the network. Okay. We have two more. We recognize the signaling infrastructure has many piece parts to it in terms of network elements, management systems, interfaces, etc. And best practice now is you need to be doing ongoing security assessment of your infrastructure. Whether you're a small carrier, large one, whatever, it's important that you maintain good security controls. You got to factor in lifecycle management. You got to factor in not just the protocols that are going across the interconnection points, but how do you manage it? The TCP/IP networks that are allowing the operations people to access a network element, an HLR or whatever. Okay. We say, well, you could do self-assessments. You could, bring in a third party that understands signaling networks and telecom. Whatever it is. Okay, but really, you need to continue in these efforts, and maybe some of the small or medium size haven't really done much in this area. It really needs to become a best practice across the industry. And maybe there needs to be some template created in terms of when you do a security assessment of a signaling infrastructure. What does that mean? How do you build from? What do you do when you look at a IT TCP/IP network, and how do you apply it to the signaling network? So maybe that needs to be built out to provide even more guidance. GSMA has looked at some of that in terms from a risk management standpoint, so maybe efforts could be built upon that. The last recommendation is we see this as shared responsibility. Sure, the carriers and the service providers, maintain the infrastructure, but we also have the subscribers that need to play their role in terms of good security hygiene on mobile devices and things like that. We also recognize that the risk assessment, as I said, has shown that individuals are targeted, groups of people, potentially key players in the government, VIPs, whatever, different geographies are being targeted. And so we're saying here that, there's a lot of available encryption technology out there to help in terms of protecting voice and data communications, and for people who are involved in highly sensitive applications or have key positions, this is something that they should be looking at using to supplement all the efforts in terms of securing the infrastructure. We're not trying to get into the encryption debate or anything like that, but we recognize that you also have to take an end-to-end look in terms of these services, but whether it's voice or data or whatever. Okay, and it's a shared responsibility. The network can only go so far in terms of protecting this subscriber. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. If there's any questions.
John, thank you very much, and thank you and Danny and your team for all the work you've done in such a short time. So we'll start in the room. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, if not, we'll go to the bridge. Any questions? All right, so those in the room, I think you know the drill by now. Everyone in favor, please say aye. Aye. Okay, anyone opposed? All right, and on the bridge, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay,
Aye.
and anyone opposed, please indicate by saying nay. Great, thank you very much. And that is our last working group paper for today and the last presentation for CSRIC 5. So thank you everyone who has worked over the past 2 years in this partnership between government, federal, state, local, academia, and industry. We really appreciate it. And I will turn it over to Jeff to close.
Thanks, Allison, and thank you as well from me. Another CSRIC finished, and we're looking forward to seeing you in your rounds around when you come in to visit with us. If you go out now, you're not going to see cherry blossoms. I think that there was a prediction that we might have those like in the next couple of days, but you might have to wait a bit longer for that. I'm sorry we couldn't bring them to you if you're visiting today. I suspect a lot of you aren't visiting today. You're visiting over the bridge. But either way, thank you for joining us. Thanks for participating. Thanks for contributing, and have a safe trip home.